In the quiet village of Eldergrove, surrounded by dense forests and shadowy hills, a mystery lingered for generations. The nights in Eldergrove were marked by profound darkness, and the townsfolk whispered about a presence that watched them from the shadows. Tales of an unknown entity spread like wildfire, and children learned early on to avoid the forest after sunset. The most feared legend was that of a creature known as the Entity. It was said to have eyes that shone like stars, observing every movement, every breath, always lurking in the gloom. Those who dared to venture into the forest after dark were never seen again. The elders recounted stories of disappearances, explaining how people felt drawn to the darkness, as if an invisible force called them. It was a warning that everyone respected. But, as with many legends, there were always those who challenged the wisdom of the experienced. Among these challengers was a group of friends: Lucas, Alice, Marco, and Clara. They were teenagers, full of courage and insatiable curiosity. One night, while gathered at Lucas's house discussing the tales they had heard, Clara proposed a bold idea. Why don't we go into the forest? What more can we discover beyond a legend? The others hesitated, but Clara's provocation was irresistible. "Are you scared?" she asked, a teasing smile on her lips. They couldn't let her think they were cowards. So, armed with flashlights and determination, they decided that night would be the one they challenged the darkness. As they crossed the village, the temperature dropped as they approached the forest's edge. The full moon illuminated their path, but the tall trees loomed like giants, casting distorted shadows on the ground. The wind whistled through the branches, creating a sound that seemed like a distant lament. "Come on, let's not let this scare us," Lucas said, trying to keep the group's spirits high. Once they entered the forest, the atmosphere changed. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and soon the group found themselves surrounded by oppressive darkness. The lanterns flickered, and an unsettling silence enveloped the surroundings. "It's just the forest," Marco tried to reassure his friends, but his voice sounded more nervous than intended. As they walked, they began to hear whispers, echoes from the past that seemed to float among the trees. "Did you hear that?" Alice asked, stopping suddenly. "It's just your imagination," Lucas replied, but his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. With every step, the feeling of being watched intensified. Lucas looked around, trying to see something in the shadows, but there was nothing but trees and darkness. "Maybe we should turn back," he suggested, but Clara, with her characteristic determination, insisted. "Not yet. We need to go deeper." The group pressed on, and soon they found a clearing. In the center stood an old stone altar covered in moss, intertwined with roots and dry leaves. "What is this?" Marco asked, cautiously approaching. Clara examined the altar, her hands brushing over the cold, damp surface. "They must have performed rituals here," she murmured, her fascination evident. At that moment, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, and the whispers grew louder, almost as if trying to communicate. "We should leave," Lucas said, now genuinely worried. But Clara was absorbed in her curiosity. "Wait, what's happening here?" Her voice echoed in the darkness. Then, something moved in the shadows. A pair of glowing eyes stood out among the trees, watching them. The group froze, hearts racing. "What is that?" Alice whispered, fear evident in her voice. "I don't know," Lucas replied, feeling adrenaline coursing through him. The eyes drew closer, and the figure began to materialize. It was an entity shrouded in shadows, with an indistinct form that seemed to change constantly. "You should not be here," the creature whispered, its voice echoing like a distant lament. "The darkness is not a place for the living." Panic seized the group, and they began to recoil slowly, but the creature advanced, its eyes fixed on them. "You were called," it said, and the voice sounded like a deep, sorrowful lament. "You cannot escape what the forest desires. Run." Lucas shouted, grabbing Clara's hand. They took off, fear consuming them. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and the whispers turned into cries of agony. The trees seemed to move, as if trying to grasp them, and the entity followed, its eyes glowing intensely in the night. The group ran without stopping, unaware where they were headed. Despair grew as the forest became a labyrinth of shadows. "We're lost," Marco shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. "We need to find a way out." Finally, they reached a small stream that cut through the forest. "Let's follow the river," Clara suggested, panting. "It might lead us out of the forest." They dashed towards the stream, but the sense of being watched never faded. As they ran along the water, the whispers continued, growing louder, as if the voices of the forest were joining in chorus. "You cannot escape," the entity whispered, its voice resonating in the darkness. "The forest is mine, and you belong to it now." Desperate, the young people tried to ignore the voices and focus on their escape. But with each step, the darkness seemed to grow denser, more oppressive. "We need to stop and catch our breath," Lucas said, pausing by the stream. "We're all exhausted." "We don't have time," Marco shouted, but it was too late. Clara looked back and saw the figure approaching. "It's coming!" she screamed, and the group began to run again. The forest felt alive, the trees shifting as if they wanted to prevent their escape. Panic overwhelmed them, and soon the group was separated. "Clara," Lucas shouted, but she was far away, lost in the darkness. "Come back," he yelled to the others, but the entity had already surrounded them, its eyes shining brightly. Lucas felt paralyzed, fear consuming him. He knew he needed to find Clara, but the forest was filled with shadows and echoes. He began to call for her, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. "You do not belong here," the entity whispered, and Lucas felt its presence drawing near. Finally, he spotted Clara in the distance, cornered against a tree. "Clara!" he shouted, running towards her, but the entity stood between them, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You cannot save her," it said, its voice echoing in the darkness. "She belongs to me now." "No, Clara," Lucas shouted, but the entity raised its hand, and a wave of energy hit him, knocking him to the ground. He glanced at Clara, frozen in fear, her eyes wide with horror. "You cannot escape what the forest desires," the entity whispered, and Lucas felt a deep sense of despair. He knew he had to fight, but the darkness was closing around him, and the forest's voices became unbearable. "Clara!" he shouted again, but there was no response. The darkness enveloped him, and he felt himself being pulled down, as if he were sinking into an endless abyss. Then, a faint light began to shine in the darkness. It was weak at first, but it grew rapidly, illuminating the forest around him. Lucas looked up and saw Clara, her hand extended towards him. "Come, I'm here," she cried. He stood up, fighting against the darkness surrounding him. The light seemed to expand, pushing the shadows away, and he ran towards Clara. "I'm coming," he shouted, feeling the energy of the light enveloping him. When he reached Clara, they grasped each other tightly, and the light surrounded them. The entity screamed, its form twisting in agony. "You cannot escape," it shouted, but the light grew even stronger, dissipating the darkness around them. "Let's go," Clara yelled, pulling Lucas forward. They ran together, the light guiding them through the forest. The entity's presence diminished, and the whispers faded into distant echoes. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest, where moonlight illuminated the way ahead. The fear began to dissipate, and they turned to look back. The entity was disappearing into the shadows, its eyes losing their glow. "We did it," Lucas said, panting as he turned to Clara. "We're free." However, as they distanced themselves from the forest, an unsettling feeling lingered. Even though they had escaped, the memory of the entity and its watchful eyes still loomed over them. The legend of Eldergrove would never truly die, and the darkness would always bide its time, waiting for those who dare to challenge the unknown. In the days that followed, the village began to heal, but the young friends knew that the entity's presence was still watching. The nights grew darker, and the whispers echoed in their dreams, reminding them that the forest would never fully let them go. Each time they closed their eyes, they could feel the entity's gaze, always watching, always waiting. One night, while Lucas was at home, he had a nightmare. He dreamed he was back in the forest, surrounded by darkness and whispers. He felt the entity's presence, its eyes gleaming in the shadows. "You cannot escape me," the voice echoed, and Lucas tried to run, but he was unable to move. He awoke with a scream, heart racing. "It was just a dream," he murmured to himself, but the terror still enveloped him. He decided he needed to tell the others about the nightmare. They had faced the entity together, and maybe, by talking about it, they could finally leave the fear behind. The next day, he met with Clara, Marco, and Alice. "Did you all dream about the entity?" he asked, anxiety evident in his voice. "Yes," Clara replied, her face pale. "I dreamed she was calling me, trying to pull me back into the forest." "Me too," Marco admitted, looking at the ground. It felt so real. "Maybe we're not completely free yet," Alice suggested, her voice trembling. "What if the entity is still watching us?" The thought that the entity might still be present unsettled them. "We need to find out how to defeat her once and for all," Clara said, her determination rekindled. "If she's still watching, we can't afford to hesitate." The friends decided to investigate more about the entity's history. They returned to the village library, diving into old books and documents that spoke of Eldergrove's legends. They found accounts of people who had disappeared over the years, all mentioning the eyes in the darkness and the oppressive presence of the entity. One night, while researching, Clara found an old diary belonging to a villager named Elias who had vanished decades ago. The pages were yellowed and worn, but the words were clear. He wrote about the forest and the beauty it concealed, but also mentioned the eyes that watched him and the feeling of being drawn into the shadows. "Look at this," Clara said, passing the pages to her friends. He wrote that the entity tries to lure people in with promises of knowledge and power, but it's really a trap. "This aligns with what we experienced," Lucas remarked, feeling the unease grow. "The entity feeds off fear and curiosity. We need to understand how to defeat her once and for all," Marco stated firmly. "If she's still observing us, we can't take it lightly." The group's determination intensified, and they began planning a new expedition, this time with a clear goal: to find the origin of the entity and discover how to defeat it. "Let's return to the clearing," Clara suggested. "If the entity was summoned there once, maybe we can use that same place to perform a ritual that will banish it forever." On the chosen night, armed with the knowledge they had gathered, the friends met again at the edge of the forest. Fear still lingered, but now there was an unwavering determination in their hearts. "Are we ready for this?" Lucas asked, looking at his friends. "Yes," they all replied in unison. As they entered the forest, the feeling of being watched returned to haunt them. The trees seemed to whisper, and the murmurs became a sinister melody, as if the very forest opposed their return. "Keep going," Clara said, her voice steady. "We can't turn back now." When they reached the clearing, the altar stood as it had before. The atmosphere was charged, and the darkness felt thicker. Clara began preparing the space for the ritual, placing herbs and salt around the altar. "Let's unite and recite the word we found in the diary," she said. "We need to invoke the light and repel the entity." As they positioned themselves, the darkness began to stir. The entity appeared, its eyes glowing in the dim light. "You have returned," it whispered, its voice echoing like a deep lament. "You have learned nothing." "We have learned," Lucas replied firmly. "We are here to end you." "You cannot stop me," the entity said, its form twisting in the shadows. "I am the darkness that watches you. You do not own us." Clara shouted, and the group began to recite the ritual words. "May the light protect us and drive away the darkness." The entity hesitated, and the light from their lanterns began to shine brighter. "Do you think mere words can repel me?" it snarled, but the light grew even stronger, surrounding the entity. "Yes, we can," Marco shouted, and together they lifted their lanterns. "We reject you. Begone." The entity screamed in agony, its eyes shining intensely as the light enveloped it. "No, I am eternal." With one final scream, the entity was consumed by the light, and the darkness began to dissipate. Silence fell over the clearing, and the friends embraced, exhausted but relieved. "We did it," Clara whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. Yet, even as they distanced themselves from the forest, an unsettling feeling lingered. Although they had conquered the entity for now, something still felt amiss. They understood that the darkness was cunning and would always seek to return. In the following days, life in Eldergrove began to normalize, but the young people knew that the entity's watchful presence was still near. The nights grew darker, and the whispers echoed through their dreams, reminding them that the forest would never let them go completely. Each time they closed their eyes, they could feel the entity's gaze, always watching, always waiting. One night, a few weeks later, Clara decided to take a walk to clear her mind. As she strolled near the edge of the forest, she felt an inexplicable pull towards the trees. Just a quick look, she thought, her curiosity getting the better of her. But as she stepped closer, a chill ran down her spine. It was as if the forest was alive, beckoning her deeper. With each step, the whispers grew louder and the shadows seemed to dance around her. Suddenly, she heard a voice, soft but unmistakable. "Clara, come to me." It was a familiar sound, the same voice she had heard in her nightmares. Panic surged through her, and she turned to run, but the darkness seemed to close in around her. Meanwhile, back at the village, Lucas, Marco, and Alice were growing concerned. Clara had been gone too long. "We need to find her," Lucas said, determination in his eyes. "She might be in danger." They rushed to the forest, calling her name. "Clara, where are you?" Their voices echoed among the trees, but there was no response. The fear grew as they ventured deeper, the shadows growing thicker and the air colder. Finally, they reached the clearing, and there, to their horror, they saw Clara standing at the altar, entranced. The entity was back, its form flickering in and out of visibility. "Clara!" Lucas shouted, running towards her, but the entity raised a hand, and a wave of energy pushed him back. "You cannot save her," the entity hissed. "She belongs to me now." "Clara, fight it!" Marco yelled, desperation in his voice. "You're stronger than this." As if awakening from a trance, Clara shook her head violently. "No, I won't let you take me." With newfound strength, she broke free from the entity's grasp, but the darkness responded with fury. The friends gathered around her, forming a protective circle. "We need to perform the ritual again," Clara said, her voice filled with urgency. Together, they began to chant, their voices rising above the chaos, determined to banish the entity once and for all. The light from their lanterns grew brighter, pushing back the shadows that surrounded them. "You think you can defeat me?" The entity screeched, its form twisting in pain. "I am darkness incarnate." But the friends stood firm, united in their resolve. "We reject you. You have no power over us," they shouted in unison. With one final push, the light surged forth, engulfing the entity completely. The screams of the creature echoed through the forest, then abruptly ceased as the darkness evaporated, leaving only the sound of their heavy breathing. Silence enveloped the clearing. They had done it. They had defeated the entity once and for all. The friends embraced tightly, relief washing over them like a wave. However, as they made their way back to the village, they understood that the scars of their encounter would remain. They had faced true darkness together, and though they had triumphed, the experience had changed them forever. Eldergrove would continue to hold its secrets, and the shadows would always linger, but they were no longer afraid. Together, they had found their strength and unity, and as long as they stood together, they knew they could face whatever darkness might come their way in the future.